All of our files are free and will remain free. If you like the show, you can show support by donating $1 to help with expenses. Just use the PayPal link on our website, YouTube channel, or Facebook page. Thanks.
Welcome back to part 2 of this very exciting program we have now today with Peter Levenda, and we're focusing mainly upon his book called Ratline. And of all the information there, we are also focusing upon the disappearance of Adolf Hitler, because it's high time that people grow up and take heed of the facts as we know them. Now, we've been through a lot of stuff regarding this. I think the next natural question would be to focus upon where Hitler disappeared. But before that, Peter, you have a new book out now. I want to give a little attention towards that. What's that book called and what is it about?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about it. My latest book has just come out. It's on the Welsh alchemist Thomas Vaughan. It's called The Tantric Alchemist. And the subtitle is Thomas Vaughan and the Indian Tantric Tradition. And what this is about, it's a study that I've been involved with since, believe it or not, 1968.
Wow.
Which is when I became involved in this. I read a book when I was a teenager called Thomas Vaughan, Mystic and Alchemist, The Works of Thomas Vaughan, Mystic and Alchemist. It was by the famous English occultist Arthur Edward Waite. But basically what it was just a compilation of Thomas Vaughan's writings. He was an alchemist of the 18th century. And it had a foreword by a famous American author called Kenneth Rexroth. Kenneth Rexroth was sort of a philosopher. He's considered by some to be the father of the beatniks. He was a guy who was very involved in Asian religion and Zen and that sort of thing, which was very popular back in the day, back in the 1950s and 1960s in the United States. And his foreword to this book really intrigued me a great deal. He said that the works of Thomas Vaughan about alchemy were much more than what you might think, that in order to understand Thomas Vaughan's writings, you have to understand Indian Tantra, you have to understand yoga, Chinese alchemy, and that sort of thing. And I'm not going to tell you how that fits in because it killed them. In other words, Thomas Vaughan and his wife both died prematurely under mysterious circumstances. His wife died first, and then he died later. But it was a couple.
In France, right?
No, in England.
Oh, in England, okay.
In England, in London, actually. So you had a husband and wife team. They were both alchemists. This was unusual in and of itself. Thomas Vaughan credits his wife with a lot of discoveries, but she dies of a mysterious illness, and then a few years later he dies in what appears to have been an explosion involving mercury. We don't know the details because there's conflicting reports about that. Anyway, I was very intrigued because Rexroth says, listen, Thomas Vaughan gives the show away when it comes to alchemy. He actually reveals the whole thing if you can understand what he's saying. If you can read, between the lines, understand the code, you'll understand what happened and what alchemy is all about. And then he ends it like that, so you're stuck with this. And I was 18 years old. I read this and I said, well, I've got to find out what this is all about. And that began, decades of research, sometimes conducted furiously for weeks or months at a time, and other times just when I had time to do it along with everything else. But I went to school to learn Mandarin Chinese in order to read Chinese alchemical texts that had not been translated yet. I did a lot of that. It took me around the world. I wound up going all over Asia. I wound up going all over Europe, South America, everywhere. And every time I did go to a different country, I had another agenda. I could look this up or look that up or talk to these people. So I managed to mix business with business, you might say, and keep doing this. So finally, I decided, I could keep researching this the rest of my life. Let me put down between two covers what I've already uncovered about this, and to demonstrate to people that if they were to pay attention to just the recent books that have come out, the recent studies in the last 10 or 15 years on Indian alchemy and on Chinese alchemy, if they were to read those, and I give guidance where that's concerned, you can then turn right around, read Thomas Vaughan, and the beam will fall from your eyes. You'll be able to read Thomas Vaughan like you're reading a tantric text, not just an obscure alchemical text with lions and dragons and the Philosopher's Stone and all the rest. You'll be able to understand it.
Yes, I saw that. It's so interesting. I've never seen that combined with the Tantra.
Well, Tantra actually turned out to be the key towards understanding Western alchemy. Indian and Chinese alchemy used exactly the same terminology that's used in Europe for the European alchemy, except that in India and in China, the emphasis is on using those terms to refer to specific biophysical properties. It refers to things taking place in the human body as opposed to only in metals. So it suddenly became very easy to use their terminology, their concepts, to swing over to the Western alchemical texts and actually decode them. It suddenly became obvious that Western alchemy is really Tantra.
Okay, I can buy that. But in Western alchemy, they have this division where you can have several fields of study, where you have the metallic alchemy, obviously, right?
Yes.
You have the spagyrics, plant alchemy.
Yep.
Then you have the human alchemy, which is apparently what you're talking about here. The personal transformation in your body. And then you have what's most popular today, which is the symbolic, like spiritual alchemy. Oh, it's all metaphors.
Yeah.
But the same principle for one area can be transferred to the other areas. And by the way, the bodily alchemy has been the weakest, as far as I've noticed, in the Western tradition. Unlike the Eastern, which, have yoga, Tai Chi, all these things. So what you're saying here is that you can actually decode Western alchemy also in a bodily alchemy aspect. That's incredible.
Well, it is, and it doesn't negate the other forms of alchemy. All forms of alchemy, all approaches are correct. Tantra is not strictly about the body only. Of course, it also takes in a Jungian, symbolic aspect. It takes in the metallic, the spagyric. All of that is included, especially in Indian alchemy, which covers all of those areas. So by understanding Indian alchemy, by reading some of the lately translated texts on Indian alchemy, it suddenly becomes very clear that you can do the same to Western alchemy, and Thomas Vaughan is the linchpin to all of this. He's the connection, because Vaughan really did write a lot about bodily alchemy, about psychobiological and biochemical processes, very thinly veiled in his texts. So it suddenly became quite obvious. Even the one illustration that he has, there's only one illustration of all of Thomas Vaughan's writings, and it's a magic mountain. And if you take that, as I did in my book, and compared it up against Chinese diagrams from the White Cloud Monastery in Beijing, which is a Taoist alchemical monastery, if you compare these two illustrations, they're actually talking to each other. They're the same illustration, just a Western context or a Chinese context, sort of step by step, to show why you can use Tantra and Chinese alchemy to understand it. So I think they have to digest this and then get back to me.
Yeah. So you actually provide this kind of key then to decode it?
Yes, I do.
Wow,
yep.
Cool. That's a must-have. But just quickly, when did Thomas Vaughan live?
In the 18th century. He was part of the entourage around the Stuarts. He was very involved with the Stuart monarchy, which was the Catholic monarchy that was kicked out briefly by Cromwell, and all of that during the English Civil Wars. And then he came back into favor when James, the Stuarts were restored during the Restoration. He worked for the king as an alchemist. Actually, he had an official position there. He was part of the group around the founding of the Royal Society. So he was a very well-known...
Right. So he was a Freemason too?
Well, I don't know if he was really a Freemason. That's not made very clear. But there's a lot of Masonic allegories in his work. Plus, he was very much involved with studying Rosicrucianism. He actually published the first English language translation of the Rosicrucian manifestos.
Yeah, right. Okay, I have so many follow-up questions.
Yes, right, exactly.
So I can then say that we're actually going to have later on, though, we're going to have a series on alchemy, so to speak. We're going to interview people like Adam McLean, Dennis Hawke, people
Sure.
who, yeah. So I suggest we do a program on this book, this finding too.
Why not?
Now, just to tip you about this, in case you haven't noticed, there is some very fresh revelations now regarding the Rosicrucians. We've had 2 programs on it already. And I know there's claims about this, every year there's a new book about this, but this time it's the real deal. It's a bunch of people who has decoded, they have decoded, among else, Shakespearean works and also some classical alchemical works and Rosicrucian manifestos. And it all seems that, to make a long story short, there is this so-called treasure map. It's a Templar treasure. It's led them to Nova Scotia. It involves King James. It involves the Invisible College, Francis Bacon. It's very interesting. It seems that the Rosicrucians really was a project, a proto-Masonic project. But I'll not ramble more about this now. It's just to give you a tip about that, and the listeners who are interested in that, go check our programs about this. Now, to the agenda today. I think it's natural to start with the escape route, because for the listeners who listen to this now, depending on when they're listening to it, you may already have access to our other 2 shows on the same topic with Cooper of the Shark Hunters and Gerard of the Grey Wolf approach. Now, all of you 3, and even if we include Farrell, who has also touched lightly upon this on another program, you all agree upon many main points, but then you have a little different takes on it, which is kind of natural because we know what didn't happen, but to find out what really happened is a bit more difficult.
Sure. And
you all are primary researchers, so you all have your own leads. Now, which escape route of all the potential that we know exists, and all of them may have been used by different Nazis, but which one do you think Hitler applied?
Well, this leads us to a very interesting state of affairs. When I published Ratline, I was of the opinion that had Hitler escaped, he used the monastery route. He took the monastery route out of Italy, out of Europe, to South America first. So that would account for the sightings in Argentina.
Yeah, but how did he go from Berlin to Italy then?
Oh, I would say there was Berlin to Salzburg, and Salzburg across the border, across the Italian Tyrol, into Bolzano. And from Bolzano, which was the major transit point for refugees and Nazis escaping justice, from Bolzano got the paperwork that he needed, the false documentation, and then was secreted either across northern Italy to Genoa, which is where most of the people went. They got onto boats and went that way. There was a south escape route as well that went down the eastern coast of Italy, and that went across the Mediterranean to the Middle East, to the Suez Canal, and then to other places from there.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be very risky to put the king rat in the most trafficked rat line?
Probably he would be safer that way.
Oh, okay.
It might be that he would just blend in with all the other refugees that were trying to escape. I mean, you have to understand that Bolzano, this is an Italian town in the Italian Tyrol. Bolzano was also known as Bozen. It was a German and Italian town. And in the height of this period, 1945, 46, 47, people walked the streets in SS uniforms openly. The Germans were there. No one was arresting them. They were pretty much free to come and go. There's photographs of German soldiers and SS officers in their uniforms hanging out in the cafes in Bolzano.
Right.
I mean, it was because there was no government. The Italian government had fallen apart. The Austrian government was chopped up between the Soviets and the British and the Americans and the French. Everybody was carving out a piece of everything. There was chaos. Yeah. So Bolzano was an excellent place to try to hide. A lot of people did. They managed to catch some people on their way out. They managed to catch, I think, some of Goering's relatives on their way out. I think some of Bormann's relatives were caught trying to cross that way because they were on the lookout for them. But if you weren't looking for Hitler, if you were told that Hitler had died and you didn't know that Eva Braun existed, your eyes, we've all seen spy movies, right? Where if a spy wants to escape, he travels with someone else.
Yeah.
Because whoever looking for him is not looking for a couple. They're not looking for a family. They're not looking for a married couple. They're looking for one guy on his own. And it's just a psychological thing. You're looking for this guy. You have a picture. You have a wanted poster. You're looking for this one guy. A couple shows up. You hardly even notice who they are.
And of course, the man, he probably has no mustache anymore, and he has glasses.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And he has this blonde companion, who's walking with him. I mean, anything would have been possible. So it's possible he could have gotten out that way. Or alternatively, there were a lot of rumors that he did leave on a plane, wound up in Denmark, and left that way.
Yeah, and Joseph's take is the U-boat to Norway, and then I think it's Spain.
Yeah.
And then the bomber Kammler.
Yeah.
He had a plane, I think this Junker plane that went to South. And then we know there's a lot of U-boats who did pop up. I think Cooper of the Shark Hunters, I think his argument is a U-boat.
Yes, and it makes sense.
So there's many possibilities.
There's many possibilities. I mean, the U-boat thing makes excellent possibilities because Admiral Dönitz himself came out and said, we have a place for Hitler to escape to if he needs it. It's a paradise, and he was the head of the U-boat operation. He would get Hitler out by U-boat. He ran U-boat fueling stations in northern Spain.
And he was the assigned successor.
Exactly. So why not? That makes excellent sense as well. The U-boat escape route makes excellent sense. And we know that U-boats showed up in Argentina, months and months after the end of the war. Months and months after the end of the war. How was that possible, right? So it happened. They were able to do that, and they could have gotten anybody out. And there's so many rumors that the U-boats disgorged passengers and artifacts of some kind in Argentina before the U-boats surrendered to the Argentine authorities. So,
But you favor at least then that he the most probable route is that he ended up in Italy, and from there he went to...
Italy seems likely if everybody else is to be believed. The reason I go there in this case is because of something very specific. I came across in all this research a diary, an address book that was written or kept by an Austrian war criminal. And in that particular document, we have the name and address and contact information for Krunoslav Dragonovic, who was the Catholic Monsignor, the Croatian who operated out of Salzburg, Austria. We have names and addresses for a lot of other people, some of them prominent Nazis or prominent people in the underground, connection points and all of the rest of it. And this notebook was allegedly in the possession of someone who claimed that he was Hitler himself. And Ratline was kind of based around this concept. First, hearing from Nick Bellantoni that the skull the Soviets had was not Hitler's, and then hearing rumors that there was an Argentine connection, an Indochina or Indonesian connection to all of this, led me to start unraveling all of this. And I came across a book that was published in the Indonesian language, which was an account of Hitler's escape to Indonesia, which on its own, not that convincing, until I saw copies of the documentation, which then really got my attention because no one could have known this at that time. No one could have known some of the details that were in this book. The address book itself was extremely suggestive that whoever had it in Indonesia had been a Nazi, was part of the Ratline. And so I had to stop and wait and say, what was the Ratline doing extending all the way to Indonesia, to Southeast Asia?
So Indonesia was not one of the common Ratline end stops?
Not at all. It was never mentioned. Asia was never mentioned.
But it is a Muslim country.
Absolutely.
So it would be one of the safe havens for Nazis.
It's not only a Muslim country, but the man who became the first president of Indonesia, Sukarno, had made speeches during World War II in favor of the Nazis and in favor of the Japanese Empire. So he had definite pro-Nazi sympathies, at least during World War II. He would have been considered somebody who was congenial to using his country as a safe haven for Nazis and for Nazi gold, let's not forget. I found out during the course of the investigation that 40 tons of Nazi gold made its way out of Portugal to Macau And from Macau, 20 tons of that gold went into China, and another 20 tons of gold went to Indonesia. We don't know what that was paying for, but then we have this guy showing up in Indonesia with this document showing how he escaped the Allied forces in Austria, in Salzburg, wound up in northern Italy, and then from northern Italy wound up with a big missing piece in there, but somehow wound up in Indonesia in the 1950s. So that got me thinking, that got me researching, and that's what happened. That's how Ratline was born. And then after Ratline was published, I was able to actually see some of this original documentation for myself. I made a trip to Indonesia and to Singapore, and I was able to see a lot of this documentation and to satisfy myself that it was genuine, and to do some more research on the ground to determine whether or not this person who escaped was actually Hitler or not. So this was part of the research that I did. It does not discount the research done by Cooper and others that there was Hitler sightings in Argentina. For the longest time, I felt the same way. I felt that Hitler might have wound up in Indonesia at the end, but that he could easily have used Argentina as a stopping off place to stay there for a year or two before he went on to Indonesia.
Yeah, because my thought has always been, because I've known your theories and the others, but my thought has always been that no matter where he ended up, immediately after the war, Hitler, unlike Bormann, was completely dependent. I mean, he's the head leech, so he needed people. And if we should believe the reports about his state of mind and his health and all that, so he needed people to help him. Yeah. And since you yourself say that there wasn't a populated Ratline to Indonesia, at least he needed to come to the already established Bariloche, Patagonia, all this stuff first, at least, by the protection of Bormanns and others. And then, well, you can take it from there. So you're still open that
certainly.
His first route was Argentina.
It's possible. I've seen more documentation on this person who lived and died in Indonesia to show that there is a lacunae in this whole story. For some reason, he sails, the person that I'm talking about who wound up in Indonesia, sailed from the Netherlands on a Dutch ship in the 1950s, although he had escaped in 1946 to northern Italy. So there is this, there's a space of time for which I have no documentation. I don't know where he was or what he was doing for about 6 years.
So in that notebook there was a void of notes.
Absolutely, there's a void of information completely.
Have that been removed, or was it just that it wasn't a chronological diary?
It wasn't. I don't think it was removed. I think it just simply wasn't chronological. I think that part of the problem was the passport. This guy had a passport issued by the West German government at the time, and had not been used at all until a certain specific time. That doesn't mean he didn't travel under another passport, under another name, and wound up in another country. But for some reason, it was around 1952 or so when this gentleman decided, I'm going to leave via Antwerp and wind up in Jakarta. So there's this period of 6 years when I have no idea what he was doing. He had all the information he needed, including a source for Spanish language lessons is in that book. Wow. Everything is there for him to get out of town and get to Argentina. Did he go or not? I don't know. But this is my feeling. Would Hitler... Yes, go on.
Yeah, sorry. No, you go on.
I was going to say, would Hitler have felt secure in Argentina among a lot of Nazis when they had tried to kill him in July of 44, when Himmler had betrayed him by going straight to the Americans to cut his own side deal, when everything was falling apart around him? Would Hitler have been secure in Argentina, surrounded by people who may decide to feather their own nest by dropping a dime on him, as we used to say, by calling the authorities and having him picked up? I think Hitler would have eventually found himself feeling pretty nervous in those circumstances, and maybe thought to himself, maybe I better get out of Dodge while I still can. And, I grew up with a guy, not grew up, but I went to war with a guy called Walter Hewel, who was a famous Indonesian expert who had spent 10 years in Indonesia in the 1920s, who told me all these great stories about Indonesia. He was like the last guy to leave the bunker in May of 45 We don't know what happened to him.
Hang on, so this childhood friend of Hitler was in the bunker with Hitler?
Yeah, not a childhood friend, but he was part of the beer hall putsch in 1923.
Yeah, okay.
He marched with Hitler. He was arrested with Hitler, went to jail with Hitler. He was one of the old guard, one of the old true believers. He was a kid at the time. He was a teenager when he marched with Hitler and Himmler at the putsch and wound up in prison. But then he got out and went to Indonesia, stayed there for 10 years, came back and became kind of an ambassador without portfolio. He hung out with Hitler, told Hitler all his great stories about life in Indonesia and all the rest of it. And then at the end he's one of the last people to leave the bunker, one of the last people allegedly to see Hitler alive, disappears into Berlin in May of 1945, is never heard from again. He's another guy who escapes that we don't know anything about.
Right. But that means that while Hitler was building up his Third Reich, this guy was in Indonesia, making a career there.
Well, he was building up his Nazi party. When Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, he called Walter Havel back from Indonesia and then helped him to build up the Third Reich.
Yeah. And it makes perfect sense because eventually Hitler must have realized that he cannot trust Bormann, that Bormann is in it for his own ends, that Bormann wants to be the new king.
Yeah.
So if he was smuggled out with the help of Bormann or by his protection, at some point even Hitler must have realized that I'm kept in the dark here. And then I guess the big question is, did he wither away? Like the Grey Wolf take is that he died lonely, sick, bitter. Even Eva Braun and the kids left him. Or did he, move on? Which I think most people in his shoes would probably try to do that. Now, a very timely question then is, if you are the most well-known, most hated escapee of the time, you are somewhere in Patagonia in the 50s, what would be the most natural route to get to Indonesia? Would it be to cross the Sea of, what you call it in English, Sea of Silence, Pacific Sea?
Yeah. Or
would it be to go across the Atlantic and then, for instance, through Netherlands? What would be the most logical choice? I mean, the geography hasn't changed, but given the possibilities of the day, the political, technical climate of the day.
Certainly. You would have gone by ship. Air travel at that point was not that common. International air travel would have been expensive, and also you would have been too conspicuous. I think you would have gone by boat under any circumstances. It's possible you could have gone back to Europe and taken that route if you felt secure enough to do so, that you weren't really going back into the lion's den to go back to Europe?
No, not in the 50s.
No,
not in the 50s. It was over. But I'm thinking maybe the travel arrangement was easier that way at that point?
From Europe, I think it was easier because you could catch a ship at Antwerp that would take you directly there. It would stop briefly in Egypt at the Suez Canal and then wouldn't stop again until they reached, in this case, the documentation I saw was Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
And then from Sri Lanka to Singapore to Jakarta, which is how that particular route went.
And we know there are Nazis in Egypt and on the road.
Oh, yeah, that wasn't a problem. What we do know also is that Indonesia, at that point, the Indonesian people in general would not have been that aware of Hitler, of what Hitler looked like, or all the rest of it. They had their own problems. They just fought a revolution, a rebellion against the Dutch after they had been invaded by the Japanese. They had their own problems, and the Nazis were a world away. There was no internet, newspapers were few and far between. Most of the people were living in an agricultural life in Indonesia. It would have been the perfect place for him to go and not be noticed, except as another crazy white guy,
Yeah.
And the man that I'm talking about did not choose to live in Jakarta, in the capital of the country. He went to a far removed island on the other side of Bali,
Wow.
all the way in a remote part of the Indonesian archipelago. So there he is functioning in this little remote area. And he tells, he has a wife there, an Eva Braun lookalike, who then leaves him in the 1960s and goes back to Europe. So he's there on his own.
Interesting. So in your scenario, he's also left.
Yep.
Ah,
yes,
yeah.
he's also left.
Huh.
He marries a local woman, converts to Islam
Wow.
to marry this woman, and becomes a Muslim. So, all these wild stories, and there's photographs of this guy, and there's his grave. He goes in 1970, January of 1970, to the city of Surabaya, a very big port city in Indonesia. We don't really know why he does this, because he never wanted to leave that island. He was paranoid about leaving the island. He knew what would happen if he left. So even though his wife made several trips back and forth to Europe and back to Indonesia, he would never accompany her. He would never leave the island. He wanted to stay on the island. But for some reason, in January of 1970, he seems to have an appointment. He has to see someone in Surabaya. And this is concerning the documentation that I saw.
Yeah.
He winds up in Surabaya and he dies the next day.
Just what, dies? I mean...
He's dead. He's dead. He's in a hospital. He's dead. We don't know the cause of death. We don't know what that was all about. All we know is that there's a picture of him as a corpse in a small hospital in Surabaya.
Right.
I went there. And then I went to the cemetery where he's buried. Now, to add to this mystery even more, I went to the cemetery. The headstone, and everybody knows this headstone because it became famous in Indonesia once this Hitler story started to come out.
And when was this? When did it come out in Indonesia?
Just recently. It came out in the...
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, it came out first in the 1980s. There's a long story involving that, and then it was quashed by the Suharto government, which was in charge.
Interesting.
And it was quashed by that government. The man who broke the story was a military officer and a medical officer, and they told him basically to shut up and stop talking, and he did. And then he died, and then the long story ensues. Documentation passes between the relatives to someone else, and then the story comes out again. An arms dealer in Indonesia now starts to pursue the story, somebody with ties to Moscow. I mean, it's rife with all this conspiratorial stuff, but it's all documented, you know.
Yeah.
So I go to the cemetery and I look at the tombstone, and there's no dates of birth or death on the tombstone.
Huh.
They have his name.
Yeah.
It's not Adolf Hitler. It's Georg Anton Poch.
Could you repeat that name?
Georg Anton Poch, P-O-umlaut-C-H.
Okay. So that's a German name.
Yeah. And they have his name, but that's the cover name. That's the name that he was going under. And he's buried there, but if you know anything about Islamic cemeteries and Islamic tombstones, I'm assuming you don't, you cannot bury somebody without the date of their birth and the date of their death, especially not the date of their death, right? This is the only tombstone in that entire cemetery that does not have those dates on it, because they really didn't know who's there.
Right.
They don't know when that person was born, and even the death date evidently seems to be up for grabs. It seems to be controversial. So it's this is the strangest thing that I've seen. I have a photograph taken there. I've taken some film footage.
Yeah, I've seen it.
It is a bizarre thing. But he died in January of 1970. And as we talked about at the top of the show, Yuri Andropov of the KGB in April of 1970 then orders his people to dig up the bodies they have of Hitler and destroy them completely.
There's a connection.
Yeah.
And also, you can't ignore the fact that if the government in Indonesia didn't have something to hide, they would probably encourage such a story. It could mean tourism. It would put them on the map.
Yeah.
It's a peculiarity.
Sure.
But if it's something serious behind it?
There was something serious. Suharto and his government came down on this very hard. I've gone through a lot of documentation on this, a lot of which I was not allowed to include because of arrangements with the owners of the documentation. However, I do have a photograph of a couple of pages of that documentation in the Hitler Legacy to show that this is genuine stuff. And I, again, included a lot of other additional information. I have more, which I'm waiting to publish. I'm just waiting for an okay to do so. That might happen this year or next year. And if so, then the whole story will come out to the satisfaction, I think, of historians. But at this point, I'm not convinced. I want to be very clear to everybody listening. I am not convinced the man who died in Indonesia was Adolf Hitler. I am 100% convinced this was a war criminal. This was somebody who was fleeing for his life, who used the ratlines to escape, who was intimate with the details of the ratlines in ways that I have not found anywhere else, and that this is the actual notebook of a person who escaped along those lines that has survived the war. So all of this is important, and I think that there's a lot of additional information that's yet come to light on the extent of this guy's relationships with some very famous names in the Nazi underground. So I'm waiting for, as I say, permission to release this information. And then when I have it, you're going to see there's a lot more depth to the story than I realized when I started it. But it is something, it's phenomenal. It's a ratline that extended all the way to a remote island in Indonesia. So it's great stuff.
Yeah, and which is a perfect hideout. Retired people today, I mean, Bali, for instance, is a very popular.
Oh, yeah.
It's like it's the island in the sun, right?
Sure.
So what better place to put your hero if he's going to live out the rest of his days irrelevant to what's going on in the world scene? Put him to something very resembling of paradise.
Sure.
Which is away from the world public.
And which brings me back to that National Lampoon cover, of Hitler in a bamboo chair with a tropical drink.
So life imitates art or the other way around.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you said there was a photo connected. By the way, this man, no matter who he was, if he was so connected, he must have been an important man, and there's not that many candidates.
Exactly. And there's one more wrinkle to the story. Mm-hmm. And the wrinkle only came to light after my 3 books were published. I have a website where this has been discussed and brought up, and I've talked about it there. One of my readers, a very close reader, as we call them, had gone through Ratline and then went through Hitler Legacy and noticed a connection that I had not noticed myself. Okay. Actually identified a mystery and revealed it. This is a person who lives in Europe, who's familiar with the German language very well and all the rest of it. So this was very good background credentials for this sort of thing. Came and pointed out to me the fact that one of the notations from this man's notebook that I could not understand, that I could not decipher, that I mentioned in Ratline, I inadvertently, without knowing it, referred to it in Hitler Legacy in a completely different context, which is why I didn't see it. Okay. There was a bank, a small, bizarre little bank in Jakarta called the PT Galaxy Trust. And this little bizarre bank on a remote street, on a side street somewhere, I think it's not really a bank like a commercial bank or retail bank. I think it's more of a private bank, was dead center in the midst of one of the biggest scandals in Indonesian history of the 20th century, which was involving something called the Sukarno Revolutionary Fund, and involving the gold certificates, Sukarno's gold certificates. This was a bizarre story. There was a man called Demanik, who was an Indonesian former police officer who was involved with the bank, who had possession of certificates for billions of dollars. I'm not exaggerating, billions of dollars worth of gold, which allegedly belonged to Sukarno and Sukarno's heirs. He tried to negotiate these instruments in the United States at the Federal Reserve, was promptly arrested, and then promptly released, went back to Indonesia and mysteriously died.
When was this approximately?
This was quite recently, in the 1990s, I believe, is the latest. I think he died before the 21st century, so late.
I've heard about this scandal.
Yeah. Well, the address of that bank is the address in the notebook of the German who died in 1970.
Wow.
When the reader pointed this out to me, saying, you're talking about the same thing, suddenly the whole thing began to become a lot clearer. There's a tremendous scandal in Indonesia over this, and the Revolutionary Fund was supposedly the brainchild of Hitler's finance minister, Hjalmar Schacht. Hjalmar Schacht survived the war and then went on to become an advisor to various international governments, including the government of Sukarno in Indonesia. He recommended to Sukarno to create a kind of crescent of resistance against communist China, and to create a kind of new caliphate, an Islamic state. He recommended this to Sukarno to create this buffer zone, and then he was involved in talking about how to finance it. This is around the time when 20 tons of Nazi gold made its way into Indonesia to Sukarno's regime.
Right.
And it's when this bank was set up. It's when our German arrives in Indonesia, and then he and his wife, whoever they are, each have an account at this bizarre unknown, anonymous bank in Jakarta. And then, of course, he dies in 1970. She died. She disappears. We don't know when she died. She completely disappears off the face of the earth.
But you said she went back to Europe.
She went back to Europe and disappears.
How do you know she went back to Europe?
I have documentation to that effect.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I'm satisfied on that. She sent a letter back to her husband in Indonesia, and I've seen the envelope and the stamp and the franking on the envelope and everything else. So she definitely was there.
But you haven't seen the letter?
The letter, no, never survived.
Oh.
So there's a lot of mystery to this, but the mystery is obviously connected to Nazi gold, the Sukarno Revolutionary Fund, the famous gold certificates, and the deaths of a number of people surrounding this particular scandal.
But didn't, what was his name, the leader of the Indonesian country? Sukarno? Was that his name? Yeah. Yep. Didn't he do something with the gold, get away with it or something? I forgot the details.
Yeah, what happened was there was the famous Bandung Conference, which was the Conference of Non-Aligned Nations, which was he was setting up to say, plague on both your houses. No to the United States, no to Russia. We're going to have our own World Bank, our own International Monetary Fund. Screw all of you guys.
You're thinking big.
Really? Yeah, this is what he was doing. And he said, we're going to create the revolutionary...
And so confident.
Yes.
And so confident.
Yeah.
There must be a reason. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, so he created the Revolutionary Fund for this reason. It was going to help finance other countries. They wouldn't have to go to the United States or to China or to Russia or anywhere else. They'd be independent. They'd have their own independent source of wealth that they could draw upon. Of course, Sukarno didn't last. He was deposed and then he died. Suharto took over. But during Suharto's regime, the successor to Sukarno, who created the military regime, a military dictatorship in Indonesia, word came out about the Revolutionary Fund. And one of Sukarno's deputies, one of his cabinet ministers, was in jail, in prison, in Jakarta. And he went and told Suharto, okay, if you cut a deal with me, I'll let you know where the fund is. And that was reported in the Singaporean press, the Indonesian press. This was a real news story, not some conspiracy thing. It was right there in the major news. I have copies of the articles. And this guy is saying, I know where it is. I know what it is. We have to cut a deal. You have to let me out. And then suddenly there's a news blackout on this. Suharto controlled the press. He controlled, the censorship apparatus. We never heard anything more about it. And then, in the 80s and the 90s, then we have a guy like Demonic, who's running this bank, and it says, my goodness, I have these gold certificates. Let me see if I can negotiate them. They are supposed to be only negotiated by Sukarno's heirs, the heirs to that fortune.
Which is Suharto.
Well, Suharto's dead. I mean, no, Sukarno's blood relatives, not Suharto.
Oh, right.
Sukarno's actual blood relatives are the only ones who should be able to cash these in. The problem is some of Sukarno's relatives are fighting to get this money released, but they can't find it. They can't find the gold. They have certificates which are
but not to back it up, right?
They don't know who has it. And then there's other relatives who are saying, well, Megawati being one of them, one of Sukarno's relatives saying, well, we don't know if this gold really exists, but if it does, it belongs to the Indonesian people. I mean, there's this idea that the Revolutionary Fund exists, that it's Nazi gold. We know a lot of Nazi gold was buried. A lot of Japanese gold was buried in the Indonesian archipelago and the immediate last months of the war in the Pacific. We know that was going on. We know that some gold was found in the Philippines. That made a very famous case in the United States. A lawsuit against the Philippine government against the Marcos regime. And the guy who found the gold won actually against the Marcos regime. The United States courts awarded the Filipino ownership of this gold, which still has not been recovered because it's been misplaced, hidden, et cetera, et cetera. They're fighting this thing tooth and nail. So we know there's a lot of gold. We know a lot of this stuff exists. We know that Sukarno was part of it. We know the Philippines were part of it. Japan was part of it. The Nazi gold floating around the world. And now we have this strange guy, who dies in Indonesia in 1970, who left behind documentation suggesting that he was part of this operation, that somehow he had access to this gold. So we're still following the story. I'm still following it.
Wow.
I'm trying to find out the rest of it, but I'm being very careful because whoever goes after this, in a very...
This is touchy. Because this is still something... I mean, haven't you noticed that all the gold in the world seems to be disappearing?
Oh,
so
yeah.
it seems that someone is collecting all the gold.
Yeah. And there are all these reports, it couldn't possibly be. We know exactly how much gold there is in the world, on and on. And it really...
Bullshit.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to be more polite, but yes, bullshit. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, Fort Knox is empty.
Yeah.
And you're mentioning Hjalmar Schacht. Don't you think he was so inside of that even after the war?
Absolutely.
He must have been connected to the post-war Nazi state, don't you think?
Absolutely. No question in my mind whatsoever. All the research I've done on Schacht, especially his post-war movements, it's obvious that he was very much involved. He was involved with some of the financiers, the Nazi financiers operating out of Switzerland. They were helping to raise money, for instance, to defend Adolf Eichmann when he was on trial in Jerusalem. Schacht was in the middle of a lot of this stuff.
So they didn't turn their back on those that were captured by the Mossad. They actually...
Absolutely not. No, not at all.
So the last Nazis who were taken was Barbie Eichmann. Eichmann was the last one?
No, Barbie was the last one.
Was the last
Barbie was apprehended in the 1980s. He was extradited finally and wound up in France in the 80s. And that's when this story again took on a different hue. Because in the 1980s, we not only have Klaus Barbie being arrested, and for the first time, the Ratlines are being exposed. And the name of Junislav Dragonovic is being mentioned about openly, the Croatian priest who started the Ratlines. This is in the 1980s when this happens. And then there's the famous case of the Hitler diaries. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but in the 1980s, it was claimed that someone had found Hitler's personal diaries, volumes and volumes of handwritten journals.
Excuse me, are these those that were debunked by this British historian who became a revisionist? What's his name?
David Irving.
Is this the same diaries that he debunked?
Same diaries.
Right.
In fact, the diaries were actually verified by none other than Hugh Trevor Roper, the guy who invented Hitler's suicide story. He's the guy who said, oh, yes, these diaries are genuine. Rupert Murdoch was buying them for millions of dollars.
Yeah, a big story in the day.
Big story at the time. So in the 80s, there was all this talk about Nazis, all this talk about escaped Nazis. Hitler was back in the news. All of this was going on in the 1980s, which is when one of the people involved in the Indonesian story then realized the documents he had in his hand and the person that he had physically seen on this remote island in Indonesia was Hitler. He put that story together in the 1980s when he saw the Klaus Barbie story, the Ratline story. He had physically seen this man on this island back in 1960. And then suddenly he's the one who broke the story in the 1980s and then was hushed up by Suharto's government and told not to talk about it. I talked to his relatives in Indonesia. I talked to his daughter, who was so frightened by what had happened with all of the mystification that was going on and all of the intelligence guys who were involved in this thing and all kinds of people from foreign countries who were all over this story. She actually became a nun. Seriously. Yeah. This whole thing just scared the hell out of her. And there were Germans who were visiting this man in Bandung, in Indonesia, visiting him and offering him millions of Deutschmarks, at the time, in the 1980s for these documents. They wanted ownership of the documents, and he wouldn't sell them, which is how they eventually wound up in Singapore, and that's a long story too. But there was tremendous interest in the 1980s, and there was a possibility that this would have been an even bigger story than Klaus Barbie and the Hitler Diaries hoax. But Suharto's government would not allow this story to go out.
But you maintain that the diaries are a hoax, right?
The diaries are a hoax.
Yeah.
A very clever hoax. I mean, pages and pages in a very good facsimile of Hitler's own handwriting. But they're mostly excerpts from Mein Kampf and some other correspondence, and easily proven to be a hoax. A bit like the Howard Hughes diaries hoax, which was happening in the 1970s. People don't remember that very well, but there was a guy called Clifford Irving, who was an author who got involved in fabricating diaries of the famous wealthy businessman Howard Hughes. And then Howard Hughes himself was still alive, though. So he was able to say, no. Although he had not been seen, but he was still alive, yeah.
That's not so clever of a hoax, though.
Not so clever,
But
no.
Those Hitler diary hoax, didn't Hitler live then, if Hitler was this guy? Or was it in the 70s you said he died?
This guy died in January of 1970, yeah.
Okay. So then he was dead, no matter. Yeah. But you said there was a photo of him.
Yeah.
Now, I think I've seen this photo, but what do you think? Do you think he looks like he could have been Hitler just by the look of him?
Well, he does. The photos of this man in Indonesia do not look like Hitler looked from his World War II photos. But he does look remarkably like Hitler looked in his World War I photos, when Hitler was emaciated, when he had lost a lot of weight. Just subtract the weight. Look, I juxtaposed the pictures of Hitler in the trenches in World War I with the photograph of this guy in Indonesia, and they are remarkably similar.
Oh, could you send that to us so we could include it as illustrations for this program?
Sure. It's in Ratline.
Okay.
I believe it is. Let me see, make sure that it is, so I don't lead you astray. I have a lot of Hitler photographs, unfortunately. Yeah, no, I'm not seeing. It must be in Hitler Legacy then.
Okay.
I know I reproduced the photos. I'm just not finding the right ones.
No, but I've seen many so-called post-war photos of Hitler. Some are fakes, of course, but some are, just suggestions.
Sure.
So it's a kind of a blurry for me now which one this is.
Now I'm looking for my photographs, and I really don't find the one I'm looking for. So I'll send you a copy. I have that, I think, readily available.
Yeah, we'll find it and put it in as an illustration. Because I think when people see these things, it's a little easier to understand.
Sure.
Because there's so many candidates of who Hitler was, and some of them don't even look like him. I mean, have you heard about this father or something in South America? I forgot his name. Very exotic name.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I heard about that as well, sure.
Yeah. I don't think he looks like Hitler at all.
No. No, but...
So the first thing, they need to look a little like... Of course, there could have been surgery going on, even though it's a long time ago. They did plastic surgery at the day, so we have to take heed for that too, of course.
I think that there's plastic surgery, of course. Once you bring that in, then it could be anything. But so you can look at the picture of Hitler in the trenches when he's, like I say, he's emaciated because he basically was starving for most of his youth, and then you look at Hitler, look at the picture of this Austrian in Indonesia in the late 1960s, and you'll see a remarkable resemblance between those two.
So he was an Austrian even.
He was Austrian.
You know that?
Yes, I have that documentation.
Wow.
He's an Austrian. He was born about the same year, if the documentation is correct. They were exactly the same height, which is very important. As Dr. Bellantoni told me, the most important thing is if they're the same height, because you can't fake height.
No.
So if they're the same height, that's a very good indication. And they are exactly the same height. So there's a lot of similarities between the two. It's possible this was another double or something, but the man had access to the fund. He had access to the gold.
Yeah.
He lived a long life after the war in Indonesia. He had a wife who looked kind of like Eva, and died mysteriously and just before the Soviets dug up the other body in Germany. So there's a lot of synchronistic connections between these two people. I don't know if this is Hitler. I'm not insisting that it is, but I'm saying since we don't know anything now about the assassin, about the suicide, let's keep an open mind and revisit this whole story.
Yeah, and this sounds like a good candidate. Even the death is, I think, kind of a corroboration here, because you told me that suddenly he had to go to the hospital, right?
Yes.
And the day after he was dead.
Yeah.
Now that's just one of two possibilities as far as I see it. One, he got a sudden illness and it went bad.
Yeah.
But the second one is that, because you didn't say that he got ill, just that he had to suddenly go somewhere, right?
Right. Yes.
So he could have been summoned and then killed.
Well, he was summoned. I think in the notebooks that I've seen, there's a strange enigmatic notation of a meeting he was having at a hotel in Surabaya. Now, he had not gone to Surabaya. He just didn't want to leave his island. But for some reason, he had a meeting he had to attend with a man with a European-sounding name, not with a local Indonesian, in Surabaya at that time. So he goes to a meeting and doesn't recover from it.
Huh.
So was he murdered? Was it simply a coincidence? Did he have a heart attack? What happened?
Or did Bormann pull his
Yeah.
stunt?
Yeah.
I'm thinking Bormann.
I'm thinking Bormann too. Or, maybe Mossad finally got religion and said, okay,
Yes.
let's get rid of this guy once and for all.
We can't do it officially, let's do it undercoverly, because enough people hated him.
Yeah.
But if Hitler actually had access to this money, it's a bigger incentive to take him out than if he was just pushed away somewhere.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And remember, this is before the whole Revolutionary Fund became really news. Nobody even knew about it except Sukarno and his cronies and his inner circle and the heads of governments that he's setting this fund up, for. And something else is important to understand, too, about this particular gentleman who died in 1970. In 1965, which is the famous year of living dangerously in Indonesia, when Sukarno's regime was about to be overthrown because it was believed he was in bed with Chinese communists, there was a tremendous massacre of suspected communists on the island of Bali. This idyllic island was host to hundreds of thousands of people, according to one account, who were massacred on the island for being communists. At that very time, our man in Indonesia, this Austrian, decides to visit Bali.
Wow.
At a time when these communists are being massacred.
This guy who really doesn't want to leave his island.
He never wants to leave the island.
Suddenly.
He suddenly goes to Bali. And this is in the words of his Muslim wife that he married after the European woman, went back to Europe. So she's saying, I don't know, he said he went to Bali, he was going to visit some famous people from his country, something like that, those words like that, and then he comes back and he's very happy about it. And he's happy, of course, they're killing communists, right?
Yeah.
So this is a guy that was being protected by the Sukarno regime, for the money, but also maybe for ideological reasons.
Yeah, and who do you call upon to kill a bunch of communists?
Right.
Obviously, you call upon these crazy Nazis.
The experts.
Yes.
Yeah, the guys who have been doing it for decades. Yes, exactly.
Yes, his old war buddies.
His old war buddies.
So now we go to reminiscence and have a perfect view of his heavenly experience.
And raise a glass of schnapps,
In a beautiful Bali beach, yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh my God. But you've been there. There must have been stories about this man from the locals. It's not that many white people, and even if they have no clue who he is, you must have. Did you collect stories about what did he do there? What was his alibi to be there?
He was running a clinic on this remote island. He was pretending to be a doctor.
Wow, before you say anything else, that's the exact same cover story they used in South America.
Yeah.
Huh.
This was a very useful cover story. Kaltenbrunner also was using that until he was picked up. But he was going to do the same thing. He was going to escape and become a doctor and had a doctor's bag and the actual documentation of a real doctor, not an invented one. So he was going to be a doctor. The story about Hitler in South America that you're talking about, also he was a doctor. And in this island, he also was a doctor. Now, the man's name that he was using, Georg Anton Poch, was a real doctor, had been chief medical officer in Salzburg for the Nazis.
They used a real name, a real person.
They used a real name.
Yeah.
Now, I have had the tremendous good fortune to have been contacted just a couple of months ago by someone who knew him.
Wow.
Someone who grew up in Austria at the time, who knew both Georg Anton Poch and his wife, a very famous anthropologist called Hella Poch, and told me this aspect of the story. And her understanding is that George Anton was not a real doctor. He had studied medicine, but was more of a person who did statistical research and that sort of thing, was not actually a functioning doctor, just had, medical training, but was not actually functioning as a doctor, became chief medical officer for political reasons, could not actually operate a stethoscope, No. And now the stories that I got totally independently from the Indonesians in Indonesia on site was this guy was a doctor, but he wasn't really a doctor. He didn't really know much about medicine. And the man who had first seen him in 1960 and then started reporting the story in the 1980s said precisely the same thing. And he passed away a few years ago, was a medical officer, was a trained doctor. had been trained both by the Indonesian government, but also had a Western training. And so this guy pretended to be a doctor running a clinic, but he had no medical training. So we're dealing with a mysterious person claiming to be a doctor, claiming to run a clinic, in the middle of nowhere, but, was not actually a doctor. I mean, this is like shades of the boys from Brazil or something.
They all, it seems that the popular business of Nazis after the war was becoming priests or doctors.
Priests or doctors, yeah.
But I bet you that it's not so bad of a cover, because Hitler had war experience, and in the front line, in the First World War, I bet you picked up some stuff about what you call it, not war doctoring, but you know what I mean, like just primitive stuff to survive in the...
Sure, battlefield medics, that sort of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, sure. War wounds, that kind of thing.
So it's enough to pull it off for some ignorant primitives in wherever he lived, right? So.
And remember, he had tremendous long conversations with Morel and some of the other physicians who were treating him for various things. So he was a hypochondriac, as far as we know, and was always talking to doctors.
Who was Hitler or this guy?
Hitler. So Hitler was a hypochondriac, a famous guy who thought he had all kinds of diseases. He was evidently afraid that he might have syphilis, which is why he got involved with Dr. Morel in the first place, who specialized in those types of illnesses, sexually transmitted diseases. And Morel stayed, a part of Hitler's entourage right up until almost the end, and was giving him, all sorts of, stuff like cocaine and heroin and morphine and a bunch of other stuff as well. So Hitler knew his way around a hypodermic syringe. He knew his way around the pharmacology a little bit.
Many drug addicts are wonderful when it comes to insight into these things today. But it's funny because Hitler, if he was in a clinic, who paid him? I mean, who set up this clinic? Why was there a clinic there?
Exactly my point. Exactly my point in this whole research. I couldn't figure out how he could afford to live there, which is what eventually this whole thing with the bank suddenly opened my eyes as to what was going on, because he arrives in Indonesia in 1952, I believe, and then winds up on this remote island for the rest of his life. I mean, there's no money there. You don't go there to get rich. And one of his cover stories that he told, there was an American who passed through roughly around that time, 1950s, I guess, who had passed through and met the guy by accident and made a note about it in his notebook, which I reproduce on my website. People can actually read the notebook there, in which he says, this guy claimed he was there as part of something called ICA. Now, this is extremely revealing, because ICA was an international relief organization, the forerunner of USAID, which is the sort of U.S. aid agency that supposedly goes around the world and helps people with medical things and, helps them with all sorts of, water pollution and that sort of thing. This is like a formal U.S. government agency. It's been around for a long time. But USAID has always suffered from accusations that it was a front for intelligence operations. Well, ICA was the first one. It was set up by John Foster Dulles. Okay,
it stinks already. Yeah,
it stinks already.
Yeah.
ICA was extremely political. It didn't last very long. It lasted, I think, for less than 2 years or something, if I'm not mistaken. It's in Hitler Legacy. Anyway, ICA lasts for a short time, but it has some very famous people involved with it. One of the people who worked for ICA briefly was George de Mohrenschildt.
Oh yeah, him again.
Him again, who was, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald's contact with the white Russian community and possibly his CIA contact as well. Mohrenschildt worked in Yugoslavia for ICA, where he was arrested by the Yugoslav government for espionage.
Right.
Okay. So now here's this Austrian doctor who's not an American citizen, who's got nothing to do with, who hates the United States, actually, according to his documentation, and who claims that he's in the Indonesian archipelago on this remote island working for ICA. And I'm thinking, oh, come on. This is not even funny anymore. But this is something that's told to this guy in the 1950s, an American tourist who's just passing through, right? Oh. So it's recorded. It's a beautiful document, because it's recorded at a time when people just didn't know anything about this stuff. Right. So here is Georg Anton Poch saying he's working for ICA. What a wonderful cover story that is. Totally bogus,
Yeah, but it really suggests that American influences have a hand in this, CIA or someone like that.
Yeah, exactly.
And then it's not just Bormann and not just they're hiding out, they're actually protected.
Yeah.
Huh.
So that's how his wife was going back and forth to Europe at least 4 times during the time she lived in Indonesia. You know how expensive that was in those days. Still is.
And takes a long time, but also.
Takes a long time by ship going back and forth 4 times. Where did they have the money for this? Where do they have the money to set up? I've seen a photograph of a house that they lived in on the island. It's quite nice. It's really a nice looking building. I mean, so much of this, of course, you can't measure in Western terms, especially the 1950s. It was extremely inexpensive to live in Indonesia in those days, but you're still a foreigner. You still have a lot of other things that you have to pay for and do as a foreigner living in Indonesia. And you still have to function. You have to pay for all those trips back to Europe, and you're not making money locally. The local people cannot afford to pay you, except in chickens or something,
It's not high-end customers.
No. It's not a Park Avenue practice.
No.
You know what I'm saying?
He would be better off having a clinic in Patagonia then, I think.
Exactly, yeah.
And another thing, you mentioned that he was a hypochondriac, and I just realized that psychologically speaking, that's not the people who go and suicide themselves. That's the least likely suicide candidates.
Sure, because they're very squeamish about anything like that.
They're terrified of leaving. So, that suits Hitler's profile, I think. Most of these Nazis were cowards.
Yeah.
So, But you mentioned he had a wife there, not Eva Braun. By the way, if Eva Braun or whoever was his wife before this Muslim wife went so many times back and forth, it must have been on his behalf because he didn't dare travel.
Yes.
Or what do you think?
I believe so. And I think that because no one was looking for Eva Braun, she was perfectly safe traveling back and forth.
Right.
Obviously not on an Eva Braun passport, but she was traveling under an assumed name and nobody was looking for her. Nobody cared. So she was free to do as she liked. And the last trip she made, coincidentally, was the same year that Eva Braun's father died. So it looked as though she was going back because he was sick, and to attend a funeral or to be with him in his last days. Right. So that's what it appeared to be at the time. So another synchronicity, a coincidence maybe, but part of the story that kind of adds up and builds up this picture of, Hitler and Eva living abroad in Indonesia.
Okay, I have a couple of more questions here. But before I go there, I just want to touch upon this family thing. We know that many of these, like Bormann, he had family, Rudolf Hess had family, and many of them were in the dark. But according to some of these Hitler escape researchers, Hitler and Braun had children. At least they had a daughter, maybe even a son. This is the Argentina lead.
Yep.
Now, could this fit with this story somehow? Is it any traces of them having children in Indonesia, or would the children be adults at this point when they went to Indonesia? No, they wouldn't, would they?
They wouldn't.
Not in the 50s, no. So if they had children, they would have to bring them. But there's no story of children, is there?
Actually, there is.
Is it? Wow.
Yeah.
Let's hear.
In the original story that I uncovered in Indonesia, which published, as I say, in the Indonesian language, a kind of pamphlet, there is an insistence that there was a young boy living with them. I then followed that up and found out from the documentation of the Indonesian doctor who visited them in 1960 that, yes, indeed, there was a child on the premises there, a small blonde son. And they had a child, at least one, that the doctor noticed that was living there. There is a photograph, and it's a very badly damaged photograph, but it shows the couple with a small child in what looks like an Asian landscape. Really hard to make out. It's an old black and white photograph. But it appears that there was a child involved in this. Now, whether the child went back to Europe or stayed behind, or whether the child was even theirs, there is no hard and fast documentation. But there was a strange story in that Indonesian book that this child had a name, and the name of the child was that of a person who turned out to be a very famous mass murderer in the United States.
Wow.
Who was a very pro-Nazi, a neo-Nazi who was trying to kill members of other races.
Jeez.
He grew a Hitler mustache.
Wow.
He quoted, he had Mein Kampf with him in the courtroom, and he would speak German instead of speaking English when he was spoken to. He was sort of a vicious, Nazi. He was not, he was the son of a woman who lived in the United States, according to what we know. I've been trying to find out as much as I can about this guy. He was very famous in Cleveland, which is where he was arrested finally and executed not too long ago, actually a few years before I was even aware of him. He was executed for his crime. He was on death row for, 20, 30 years, something like that, and finally executed. And I've been scouring the records, trying to come up with more information. No one really seems to know much about the childhood of this guy. But according to this story, he was the same person who was eventually arrested for, for crimes, for mass murder. I think he killed...
But what did he do? Was he one of these famous American crazy white guys who just shoots around himself and kills at random?
He was aiming specifically for black people, for Jewish people. He was looking to exterminate racial enemies, quote unquote.
When did this happen?
Let me refresh my memory. This would have been... he was a young man in the 1960s, as I believe. And the name of the boy was Frank Spivak. He was like a notorious killer in the United States in 1982.
Okay.
He killed 3 people. He wounded other people in Cleveland, Ohio.
Wow.
This guy was a neo-Nazi. He wanted to start a race war between blacks, Jews, and whites.
Huh.
He quoted Hitler all the time. He wore Hitler mustache. He was tried in 1983 and eventually was sentenced to death and executed in the year 2011.
Huh.
So we're talking, he was the longest time of any American prisoner on death row.
Wow.
So
why did they give him that special favor? But how old was this guy?
He was born... Spivak was born in 1951, which is kind of the right time for our Indonesian doctor to have seen him in Indonesia in 1960, because he felt the boy was somewhere between 7 and 10 years old.
But why are you connecting him to this boy? It must be more than just Frank.
No. The Indonesian doctor specifically says that the boy was Frank Spivak, who lived with a woman called Gerda, with the man he believes is Hitler and Eva Braun on this island. He said there was a small boy there, and he identified the boy as Frank Spivak. Now, I have a problem with this, because why would he remember the name so specifically? I think he was conflating things myself. I have to leave the door open to that, because I think, roughly the right age, all of this, but I have no data to show that the convicted murderer ever lived in Indonesia. But I don't know. I have no information that he didn't. There's just simply not enough information about this boy's childhood.
But that's so weird, because from the 50s and onwards, isn't there enough information on all US citizens to know where they're coming from and where they're born, and the census and all that?
You'd be surprised. We have the information as to where he was born. We know Spivak was born in the United States, or at least we have records of a birth record of being born in Cleveland, Ohio, I think, in that time. But we don't know about his childhood. There's pieces of his childhood that are missing from the public record that I haven't been able to find yet. And I've talked to the reporters who worked on the case and who covered his execution, and even they don't have access to the information. I've contacted the prison where he was held, and they don't have it. So it's been kind of around and around in circles on trying to find more information. But I have the feeling this is a case of mistaken identity by the Indonesian doctor, because the boy was arrested, the killer was arrested in 1982 and went to trial in 1983, which was at the same time that the Klaus Barbie revelations were coming out, the Hitler Diaries hoax was coming out, and all the rest of this that convinced the Indonesian doctor to go public with his story. But of one thing there is no doubt. There was a boy living with Georg Anton Poch and his wife Hella Poch on this island in the middle of nowhere. He was a European boy. He was blonde, according to the photograph that I saw. He was wearing short pants and all the rest of it. So it looks as though, was this their child? Was this a child visiting them from somewhere for some reason? I don't know. But there was a child on site in 1960 when he was visited. So
Well, if they did have children, it would probably, and if they cared for their children, it would, and I mean, it's not that long ago, and probably to a certain degree still in Britain, that many put their children away on school. Upper class have done this.
Sure.
And to protect them, they would probably get them away from Eva and Adolf if they had children and they care for them. So it's not that far-fetched, but of course there's no evidence, but it's easy to buy the story, right? Because here we have this hateful, crazy guy who ends up like a mass murderer. Must be Hitler's son.
Well, I mean, and he dressed like Hitler and talked like Hitler. He did everything perfectly, right?
A father complex there.
Yeah.
But also it's kind of suspicious that we don't. I mean, how many stones hasn't been turned regarding, let's say, Charles Manson and other famous, bad guys? Why would this guy be protected and unknown and mysterious? That's a bit suspicious.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Why is the information so hard to get? I think Manson's case, he was a famous case, much more famous than this guy in the 80s, I guess. They caught him relatively quickly. He had killed 3 people. He wounded a few others. He, from our point of view, was obviously insane. He was even a cross-dresser. Seriously. So,
well, many Nazis had that tendency.
Yeah. Well, there you go. So we have a very strange individual, but I guess he wasn't running a cult. He didn't have a whole bunch of followers like Manson. So I guess they figured he's an anomaly and let's not pay any more attention to him, not give him the benefit of that kind of attention. And I can understand that, I guess. But I would like to know more about him, though, just for the sake of putting this one story to bed once and for all.
Yeah. That's the duty of a proper researcher. But what about his second wife and the house? Now, did you go to the house? There must be clues there. And did you talk to the second wife?
No, that's another interesting story. The second wife, now, this is something that's going to cause people, a lot of consternation. The second wife was the source of the documentation that the Indonesian doctor eventually got. He went and visited the wife in the 1980s, I believe, or the 1970s, to really put to bed once and for all who was this guy. He interviewed the second wife. The second wife was no longer living on that island. Oh. She left that island shortly after her husband died, after the Austrian doctor died. And she wound up back in Bandung, which is a city a little bit south of Jakarta. And the Indonesian doctor talked to her, got her statement. She talked about her husband. She talked about how her husband told her he was Hitler.
Wow.
Okay, which again is hearsay. We don't know if this is true, or if it is true, what does it mean really? Maybe he was just trying to claim something for himself that wasn't. But he was extremely secretive. She knew he wasn't really a doctor. She tells that, right up front. So he tells her, no, I am Hitler. You've heard about Hitler. You know about Germany and all of this. Well, I am Hitler. He tells his wife before he dies. So she tells this story to the Indonesian doctor. However, later, when people go back, including me, to go and find this woman and talk to her, she's living in a compound where across the street from the University of Bandung in Indonesia, which is surrounded by bodyguards and government personnel.
Wow.
You're not allowed to have access to this person, who it seems to still be alive. The Indonesian doctor has since died, but she seems to be alive. The second wife seems to still be alive, living in...
Hang on, who's in charge? Is this the same kind of government today?
Well, no, of course, Suharto's government has fallen. We've gone through a couple of presidents in Indonesia since then, but still she is considered protected.
So it's not a normal democratic country today?
Oh, it is, but, normal by who's, standing.
Yeah.
The army is still very powerful in Indonesia.
And intelligence services, I bet.
And intelligence services.
And they always have power.
They're powerful everywhere, So she's being protected. You can't get to her. Now, local Indonesian reporters have tried to do this, and they've written a book about it, a small pamphlet sort of, which I have as well, and I've tried to contact them, and it's been really difficult because they try to get access to her, and they could not also because of the presence of intelligence types or something around her. She is not giving interviews. Let's put it that way.
But what about the house then? Is that accessible?
The house on the island is not accessible. In the first place, we don't really quite know where it is. It was remote at the best of times. The island itself, Sumbawa, is accessible, but not accessible all the time. A couple of days a week, a ship stops by between Bali and Lombok. No, actually Bali, Lombok, Sumbawa, and then where the Komodo dragons are on those islands. So it's really next door to Komodo dragons territory. So it's not really on the main tourist run. It's difficult of access. And once you get to Sumbawa Besar, the city, the town of Sumbawa, trying to get from there inland is very, very tricky. It's a four-wheel drive situation, and no one seems to know anything about where this guy's house is. It's very difficult of access.
Well, this sounds like the perfect hideout place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anybody showing up there is going to be noticed immediately, and the communication systems are such that, you know, your presence on that island is telegraphed to everyone who might have a need to know or an interest to know. It's really difficult to do any kind of research there.
Exactly. So I think that even if there are people still around who could tell you something, the powers that be would immediately, they're probably already scared away from saying anything, those who would. No.
Yeah. As a person of European ethnicity like I am, it would be extremely difficult. Yeah. The local Indonesians had a hard enough time. And they did, you know, go there and try to get information and try to understand more of what was going on. And we're getting all kinds of stories, strange stories that they could not verify, they could not validate. So we're kind of stuck with a lot of rumors and hearsay.
Still, pictures are out. That's good. Did he have his famous Chaplin moustache on his pictures?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
He kept that. Oh,
he kept that or grew it back or whatever. That's why. I mean, he looked, you know, like I say, he looked like Hitler, the young Hitler in the trenches. It's a remarkable resemblance, and he loved the mustache. And his passport photo that he used under the name of Georg Anton Poch also has that mustache. You know, so it's weird. I'm telling you, it's very strange for an Austrian to wear that mustache
after the war
and to go abroad. I mean, come on, you know.
Yeah, if that's not an indication. Yeah. But what about the real Georg Anton? Do we know anything about him?
Other than the fact that he was a medical officer of Salzburg-Gau, he was a Nazi Party member. He lied about that to the American authorities. And in 1946, the American authorities finally realized they had a live one here, and they were going to arrest him and put him into the prison camp. He heard about it just in enough time, and he escaped. And I reproduce in the Hitler Legacy the wanted advertisement that the Allied authorities put for him and his wife in the local newspapers, offering a reward for their capture. He was not captured. He made his way into northern Italy. His wife followed soon thereafter. And then there's this missing period of time from 19...
But hang on. At this point, it could be the real one, right?
At this point, it could be the real one, sure.
Because he had reasons to go away.
Yes, he did.
But then he wouldn't use his own name, would he?
That's my point.
Right.
You know, then by 1952 or so, he's using his own name in a passport under his own name, if that is him, and he's, you know, blithely, you know, wandering out of the country. And he picked the time in 1952 when the Swiss government had relaxed their control over Nazi assets in their banks.
Right.
There was a time in the immediate post-war period when those assets were frozen. By 1952, that was relaxed. And suddenly I have indication that he went to Switzerland briefly. He went to another bank in Germany on his way out of Antwerp to Jakarta. So there's this motion that's taking place of somebody using this man's name in the 1950s in Switzerland and in Europe, in Germany, accessing money, evidently, and then getting out of the country. But between 1946 and 52, I don't know where this guy was.
No. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So actually, if it was him who went away to Italy first, then the traditional Hitler escape scenario could be intact.
Absolutely.
And then
went to Argentina and then left Argentina and came back, picked up the money, picked up the cash, and went to Indonesia with a black bag full of gold bullion or something. Who knows?
Obviously, under Bormann's protection has to be, and the CIA.
Natürlich.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh. Wunderbar. I think we've covered. Is there any aspects to this story that should be added to, or do we have mentioned the most important parts?
I think we've covered the highlights of this story. Certainly, my books cover it, of course, in much more detail.
Yeah.
But there's other people who've done research along similar lines. You've mentioned Joseph Farrell, and of course the other authors that you'll be talking to. But there's also the couple that wrote the book called The Gold Warriors, which is an important study of how a lot of the financing, post-war financing, took place. The buried gold, the Nazi gold reserves, the Japanese gold reserves, and that impinges on this story in a couple of places. So it talks even about Nixon, and Nixon's cutting deals with Japan on repatriating some Japanese gold and all the rest of it. So the political aspect of the story is covered in the Seagraves work called The Gold Warriors, and that's something that's has also connections to this whole story. Very valuable piece of work. And of course, I also used a lot of the U.S. government's recently declassified files on searching for Nazi gold, and the fact that they're scratching their heads. They come up with some of it, but they can't come up with all of it. There's a lot of it that's been missing. There's no trace of. Some of the gold wound up in the United States at various banks in New York. And then a lot of it just went missing completely. We have no idea where it went.
But you did say a couple of times that there's more info that you're sitting on that you're so far not allowed to release. Is that info that will... Obviously, you can't tell us what it is, but you can tell us what kind of info it is.
Yeah. It fills in a lot of the blanks. It fills in a lot of the blanks in the story of Georg Anton Poch. It fills in some of that, fills in some of the extent of the Ratlines that he was involved with. It includes some famous personalities that I can't unfortunately mention yet, that were involved with the Ratline, sort of iconic figures that were very much involved. The addresses, phone numbers, names are in this particular address book that was in this man's possession when he died in 1970. So there was in Indonesia. So there's a lot of, it fills out, it fleshes out the story. It's not going to be, I think, shocking revelations. I'm not going to have the smoking gun that this is Hitler, but I'm going to have a lot more information that will go, strongly towards suggesting that this might be so.
Yeah. So the case won't become weaker after that.
No.
But speaking of research, what are you up to these days? Now that you just have a book out and we know you never rest, and you have, like you said, this new book of yours was more or less in the works for ages. It was an extra thing you were researching. Yeah. But what are you up to now that you have that out of the way?
Well, Al, I'd love to tell you. Unfortunately, I can't, and not because I don't want to, because I have a contract which is binding me to secrecy until this particular project is finished. But I'm extremely involved in research. I've been doing traveling as well. It's not directly related to what we've been discussing today, but it is indirectly related in some cases. It has a lot of greater potential, but I can't talk about it.
No, but if we divide your work into, should we say, political subject themes and occult subject themes, would it be closer to the occult ones?
It would be closer to occult subjects, let's say, but it's involving the occult. It's also involving politics. I think you might say it's a lot closer. It's a lot closer to Sinister Forces in material. It's closer to the Sinister Forces trilogy, I think, if we look at it from that point of view. People have asked me, when are you going to do, volume 4 of Sinister Forces? I'm involved right now in something that's going to be volumes 4, 5, and 6. So that's what this is all about.
Oh, so it is a part of that series.
You could look at it that way. It's not officially part of that series, no, but it does take some of those themes and expands them greatly in areas that I never thought I would be involved with. I never thought I would be involved in a Hitler story, believe me.
No.
But I did, and now I'm involved in another story that I never thought I would be involved in this to this degree of intensity that I am now. But I am, so there you go.
You've been very productive the last years. If you look at your authorship, it seemed to go a little bit slower in the beginning, but you had so many books out the last years. Will there be more? I guess there will be more Nazi-themed books because of you having more info, or will you revise and expand the old one?
Yeah, it depends on what I'm allowed to do by the people who are the owners of the original documentation that I talk about. If they give me a green light to do whatever, then it might be another book-length treatment, or it just might be an expansion of one of the other books, a revised, expanded version. It depends how much they're allowing me to do. So I'm just waiting for them to make up their minds where that's concerned. I had a very frustrating time dealing with them in Singapore a couple of years ago, in which I thought I was going to be able to write about everything, and in the end they got cold feet and didn't want to. And so they curtail. I actually wrote an entire book that I have not published on this, based on that original documentation, and I have not been able to publish it. It's sitting in manuscript form because I'm not allowed to. So it's been like that. But
that can be released in the future potentially.
Potentially, yes. If I get permission, or I'll simply rewrite it if they give me permission and make it an even better book. So, there's a lot of work I have coming up in the next few years. I have my work cut out for me, I can tell you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, never rest on your laurels. But the Nazi story, maybe you feel you're done with that. But if you look at the way the world is going, and your last book is touching upon that, that too is a never-ending story as far as I'm concerned. So do you think there will be more in that area, regardless of the Hitler lead?
Yeah, it's difficult to say right now because I can't see that far. I have to see past 3 other books in my way, but there will be some of that in this trilogy that I'm working on now. But when I get past that, the world is going to have changed. Will have changed considerably by the time this is finished, even if it's only another 6 months or so. And there is a lot more material to talk about 100%. We're just now beginning to understand the ramifications of this underground operation, of this sort of secret or shadow government, you might call it, that's been in operation for so long. I was very pleased to learn a week or two ago that John Kerry visited Santiago in Chile and declassified another 280 pages of documents, I believe, concerning the CIA's knowledge of the military coup that took place in Chile in September 73, and
11th of September.
Exactly. And the subsequent involvement of groups like Operation Condor with assassinations and terrorist groups, and the military coup groups, the organizing of coups in Chile during the Allende regime, and all of this had just come out. That touches on me quite directly because I was in Chile in 79 investigating Colonia Dignidad, which was part of Operation Condor, as we later found out.
And there's a movie about that coming out, isn't it?
I believe there is, yes.
I think it's just called Colonial. It's a big Hollywood movie.
Yeah, I have.
Famous.
Yeah, it hasn't come out yet, I don't think. I'm really interested to see it because I was like the only American actually was there.
Yeah, I'm amazed you're not a consultant.
Yeah, I know. It's very strange, isn't it? But I guess they had their own angle on this. But yeah, I'm very interested to see what happens with that film if they do a good job on it.
Well, that's perfect timing because then we can have you back and talk about this because we're not done with you. We need to have one more program on this where we focus upon the heritage of the Nazis, because that's the reason we've interviewed you today and the last time about this subject is not just for historical purposes, it is also to awaken people as to what's going on in the world today. And we need to know our history. People need to know, like, this wacko Islamic fundamentalism. What is it? Where it is coming from?
Sure.
How does things fit into the large picture? And that's where you're such a valuable source.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we're looking forward to that. But thanks a lot, Peter, for putting time off your busy schedule and
absolutely
helping us understand more about this.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So you've been listening to a conversation with Peter Levenda based upon 3 of his many books, namely Unholy Alliance, The Hitler Legacy, and especially Ratline, subtitled Soviet Spies, Nazi Priests, and the Disappearance of Adolf Hitler. Each of these books have their own website where you can check out some additional info and blogging. So if you go to Peter's presentation at our website, you'll find all his links, including these. We hope you enjoyed the program, which is the first of several concerning the escape of Adolf Hitler, in a series we're doing with primary researchers in this topic. If you appreciate our programs, you can thank our dear generous sponsors who keeps the forum alive. You can also contribute to making our programs better and ensure a more frequent release by spreading them so we get more listeners, and of course by donating so we get expenses covered. Let's be honest, very few care to chip in, so we're in the process of developing different kinds of advantages and bonuses for our sponsors in the hope that it will increase the crowdfunding. However, we will not commercialize the forum, but keep the programs free for all. Now, if you find them educating, consider these words. The slaves are to work for us. Insofar as we do not need them, they may die. Therefore, health services are superfluous, their fertility is undesirable, they may use contraceptives or practice abortion, the more the better. Education is dangerous. It is enough if they can count up to 100. At best, an education which produces useful coolies for us is admissible. Every educated person is a future enemy. End of quote. Who said this? None other than the former Führer Martin Bormann. So congratulations, you are now officially an enemy of the clandestine Fourth Reich. Tonight's host has been your pal Al, with the indispensable support of the ever-growing Borealis team. Until next time, may your education blossom. Be seeing you.
Who is number one?